Yeah, hi. Good evening, everyone. So, to take up from where we left off on the last date, we have now reached a stage where, after the entire rigmarole of meeting a client, figuring out the case, drafting it, putting together a paper book, we have filed it with the registry of the court, and the matter is now listed before the judge concerned for the first hearing. Now, today I intend to take a look at some of the processes that follow immediately thereafter and how exactly does a practitioner deal with these. At the outset, when a matter gets listed in court, two things may happen. Now, if you turn out to be extremely unlucky or your case is so bad that the judge proceeds to reject or dismiss your case on the very first day. I hope this is something which you will not have to encounter much because usually notices are, issued in the majority of cases. Now, when this happens, let's say you convince the judge in terms of the relative merit of your case or the fact that it at least requires a hearing. Particularly in the case of a civil suit, usually notices are issued, summons are issued, whatever term you may use for it, a summons or a notice. Now, when this happens, there are two eventualities. One, as we mentioned on the last date, by any chance, if the other side has filed a caveat prior in time, you will obviously have to serve them a copy of the pleading which you are filing in advance. And then, in 99% of the cases, the other side will therefore be represented on the first day before the court in the form of a lawyer. In such a situation, if the judge concerned wishes to issue notice, in the order it will simply be recorded, issue notice, so and so appearing on behalf of the respondent or the defendant accepts notice. So that's a pretty straightforward process. You will essentially have the issuance of notice and the service thereof happen within the same hearing. But in the majority of cases, or a large number of cases, there is no such defendant or respondent present before the court on the very first day. This essentially leads to a requirement that once the court issues notice, the said notice or summons is duly served upon the respondent or defendant. Now, the reason why this is important is obviously principles of natural justice that no adjudication can finally take place without giving an opportunity to the counterparty or to the other side being able to come before the court and put forth what his or her viewpoint is or submissions are in relation to what your client or the plaintiff may be seeking from the court. Now, this sounds simple enough in the sense that somebody is being asked to appear before the court, but things can get a little complicated on account of a variety of reasons. You might have a recalcitrant defendant or respondent who does not want to be served, so that the case, gets dragged on for this very purpose. There might be cases where there may be genuine problems. For instance, the defendant or the respondent is situated abroad. How do you serve them? There are other issues. You may be unaware of the exact address. The person may very well be in India, but you are unaware of the exact address for whatsoever reason. So these issues can crop up, and ultimately they do contribute to severe delays in litigation. In fact, there was an empirical study conducted a few years ago where they analyzed the kind of pendency in the Supreme Court. And the authors found that a large number of the cases which were actually pending in the Supreme Court were actually not ripe for hearing because the due service had not been effected. So it's much more of a problem in the Supreme Court, which deals with cases from across the country, whereas other courts and tribunals may largely deal with cases wherein the defendant might also be situated within the territorial jurisdiction of that court, within, say, a smaller territorial or geographical periphery. Though of course, this will not apply in the case of in the case of parties which have entered into transactions or are situated across states. But definitely in the Supreme Court, it's a larger problem. So, therefore, this is also an important element of ensuring that your case proceeds further, because for the defendant to turn up is not only important for the defendant per se, but it's also important for you to ensure that the notice or the summons is duly served. Now, therefore, we will examine this element in some detail. Also, after this, we also need to consider the aspect of what happens thereafter in terms of pleadings. So, we will look at pleadings which occur post the issuance of a notice on the primary pleading, which is the plaint or the petition or application, whatever you may call it. Finally, we will also look at the kind of interim applications which are likely to be filed in a proceeding. See, ideally, this is something we should have taken a look at when we did drafting of pleadings in general. But the reason why I did not take it up at that stage is because, at least with the interim applications is concerned, there is a very wide variety. Therefore, to be able to deal with all of them in a proper manner within the limited time schedule of one class would not have been feasible, which is why I decided to take it up at this stage in the course. Now, dealing with the first element first, I had sent you this reading material in relation to these three elements one by one. Now, the first one I want to show you is this pretty comprehensive article on service of summons in civil cases. Now, interestingly, if you look online, there is very, very little material on this element, possibly because it's a slightly pedestrian, if you may call it that, stage of the proceedings, in the sense that it's nothing very glamorous about serving the other side when you compare it with the other stages of a suit or a proceeding. But this is obviously very, very critical. Now, in the CPC, though of course CPC does not apply on all fours to ancillary proceedings, for instance, say writ proceedings, etc. But this is the golden benchmark in terms of how courts ensure service on the other side. Therefore, the go-to provision is Order 5 of the CPC, specifically rules 1 to 30 thereof, which talk about what are the different ways of effecting service and what are the modalities that a party which wishes to effect service is required to follow. Now, if one gets into the specifics of the matter, the reason why this is so important is that it can make a world of difference to the ultimate result. Now, as I mentioned, implicit in this is the rule of natural justice, that the other party be given a chance to come forward and represent. But just imagine the practical consequences. You effect service on the other side, purportedly. That is what is reflected in the order, in the record. But actually, the service is defective. Now, post that defective service, let's say the court decides to proceed ex parte against the respondent or the defendant, and after, say, let's say a rigmarole or in terms of arguing, demonstrating your case, etc., the court ultimately grants you a decree. Now, armed with that decree, you try to go and execute, but ultimately the defendant turns up at a much later stage and is able to demonstrate that the service on him or her was defective. Now, this is something which will actually go to the root of the matter and completely obliterate the sanctity of the decree or the judgment which you had obtained in your favor from the court concerned. So, even though this may seem, as I mentioned, something not very crucial in terms of the overall case, a defective service can have really problematic consequences for you in the long term, and in fact completely render the decree or award which you have decree or any sort of a judgment which you've received as being completely worthless, to use the strong term. Now, which is why it is very, very important to understand that the service of notice on the other side, the proper service of notice, is extremely crucial to ensuring the sanctity of whatever decree or judgment you may obtain, particularly in cases where the defendant or respondent is proceeded ex parte. Now, as I mentioned to you when we were dealing with the paper book, memo of parties is important for this very reason, because the memo of parties is the one which provides the address to the court or the forum upon which to serve the defendant or the respondent. Now, before I go to the complexities, the most straightforward way of service or effecting service, which is also recognized under the CPC, is for the summons to be sent by registered AD. Now, registered AD is a form of a speed post wherein there is also something called as an acknowledgement due card, which will come back to you after the service is duly effected on the other side. And the postal department will then formally send you something called an AD card, which will demonstrate that service had in fact happened. But increasingly, because acknowledgement due, strictly speaking, it does not correlate to a speed post in terms of the speed, because it may also go as ordinary mail. Increasingly, you have recourse to speed post, and acknowledgement due has now become a little let's say, redundant because of these online tracking record, etc., which a speed post anyway provides to you. So generally, the law is, or the rule is, in most courts and tribunals, that you will be required to send something by speed post, and then it is due diligence on your part to ensure that the tracking report is duly generated and saved by you within time. Now, in the case of larger courts and tribunals, for instance, high courts, there is an internal process within the registry whereby you may be required, or your office may be required, to generate photocopies of the pleading, the relevant photocopy, and then put it in an envelope and affix the requisite stamp for it to be sent through speed post. And then the same is then put up before the registry or filed by you with a specialized branch of the registry, which then undertakes the final process of sending out the particular pleading to the opposite side in the form of a formal summons. They will attach a formal page at the top of that particular filing by you. So that is one way of doing it. In many courts, you are also, when the judge concerned issues notice or summons, you can request for something of the equivalent of a personal delivery. So in Delhi, the colloquial term for this is dasti, order dasti, which essentially means that you are permitted to personally go and serve the defendant with a copy of the pleading. And then later you will be required to furnish an affidavit from whoever it is in your office who has gone to serve them, stating that the service was in fact effected. There are also now modern ways of effecting service. For instance, there is email, of course, and increasingly courts have been permitting service through WhatsApp on defendants who are otherwise difficult to trace. So things are evolving naturally from the earlier AD card alone regime to a regime now which permits a multifarious methodology in terms of servicing, or in terms of serving pleadings or summons on the other side. Now, this is something which keeps evolving. And as I mentioned in the beginning, there is a wide disparity or diversity in terms of how different courts and forums actually deal with this at any given point of time. So again, the area where you're practicing in, the forum which you're practicing in, obviously you need to do your due diligence in terms of what is the specific mechanism which they follow. But overall, this is the way in which the service or the summons is actually effected. Now, as I mentioned, there is now an enhancement, or one what might call an advancement, in terms of the permission, the modes permissible, in as much as in some cases through email and WhatsApp also services provided. Though my advice would be that since the traditional mode still remains the speed post or the registered AD, it is always better to get express permission from the judge concerned in the order issuing summons that you are also permitted to serve the opposite party through email and WhatsApp, in addition to the standard modes. Because a lot of courts and tribunals are yet to formally incorporate these particular provisions in their regulations, which can lead to a problem later if there is a dispute as to whether it actually amounted to effective service or not. Now, looking beyond domestic jurisdictions, it's a little bit more complicated in the case of service of summons abroad, because naturally, when a party is abroad, the traditional markers of service, for instance, speed post, etc., might not be able to come to your aid or advantage. Therefore, ultimately, as of today, the Hague Convention is required to be followed when read with Order 5, Rule 25 and 26 of the CPC. And this can be a little complex in the sense that in the most of the cases you may be required to seek the assistance of the embassy concerned, so that the formal service can in fact be effected. Now, increasingly, once email has come into the picture, for a lot of litigants, since this is a very cumbersome process, courts are being more liberal now in terms of permitting service through email on parties resident abroad as well. But again, like I said, that is not something which is set in stone insofar as the majority of the institutions or forums are concerned. And therefore, it is again a better idea to ensure that the order specifically permits you to do this in terms of the modality. Now, there is also a possibility that the defendant or the respondent might, in a particular case, refuse to accept service. This is pretty, I mean, it's not very uncommon. And this happens in a case where whoever is the concerned person who is going to serve, let's say, a personal service, because in a lot of courts, as I mentioned to you, what happens in Delhi, But in a lot of courts, what happens is that the process server associated with the court, as also will be the case in Delhi, will go additionally to serve a copy of the copy of the pleading upon the other side. Now, the process server is somebody who is associated with the court, and he or she is an individual who is tasked specifically by the court of forum with going and serving pleadings on the litigant who is the counterparty. Now, therefore, if there is a case of refusal, this particular person, the person who's actually trying to serve, is then required to undertake a particular process whereby the fact of the defendant refusing service is clearly made out, and the requisite averment can then be made before the court, so that the court can then proceed ex parte or do as it deems fit to continue with the proceedings. Now, I must point out one aspect here. Earlier, when this process servers were involved, because earlier you didn't have much of an option in terms of an alternative methodology, there were frequently complaints or allegations in terms of the process server having to a certain extent been compromised by the other side, in the sense that in a lot of cases you would have seen reports from the process server saying that the party doesn't reside there, while in fact that particular party was residing at that address for a long period of time. So now, increasingly, with these methodologies to serve, in the sense that you will not require a physical person to be present, and on the contrary, you can do so by email or, let's say, even purely by speed post, the process server route is increasingly getting whittled down, at least in the larger cities. But of course, when you come to the smaller towns or the rural areas, the process server still remains a very important entity in this entire chain of ensuring that service is effected on the opposite side. Now, another issue which is important is a presumption. So, under the provisions of the CPC as also the General Clauses Act, the registered AD, the acknowledgement due method, has always had an advantage in the sense that there is a presumption as to service. So, if you send something under registered AD, the court has even taken the view that even if the AD card does not come back to you, there is going to be a deemed presumption of service on the respondent, though of course it will be a rebuttable presumption. But as you know, this rebuttable presumption is not something which is easy to defeat, for the simple reason that you have a stamp of approval from the postal department indicating that the service in fact would have happened, particularly if you have, let's say, a formal receipt which indicates the address to which you decided to send the particular pleading and the date on time on which you actually sent it. That's a receipt you will get from the postal department. Things have become even harder now because there is a tracking report available online in the vast majority of cases, and that would also demonstrate in categorical terms as to whether the defendant was actually served or not. But just to ensure that in the small eventuality, in a very rare eventuality, if an active fraud is perpetrated on the defendant or the respondent in terms of service of pleadings, they should have the ability or should have the wherewithal to be able to make this case before the court, and therefore it remains a rebuttable presumption and not an absolute one. Now, what is also very important to understand in the case of service of summons on the opposite side is that ultimately this is also the method which kickstarts a lot of periods. And when I say periods, I'm referring here to the strict limitation periods which will get triggered the minute there is service on you. So, aside from the fact that whether somebody was actually served or not, the actual service or the proper date of service is also critical to compute or calculate as to when the limitation period for that particular entity to file any pleading starts. This is crucial in the case of certain proceedings which are under specialized statutes. For instance, under the Commercial Courts Act, you have a strict outer limit within which a written statement is to be filed. And repeated precedent has held that this limitation period is not extendable under any circumstance whatsoever. Therefore, it is very, very crucial to be very clear on the exact date when the defendant got served, so that that outer limit can then be computed and consequences can flow accordingly. Similar would be a case, say, in the case of a matter under the Delhi Rent Control Act, when a very, very tight period of 14 days is provided for the tenant to respond to an application or a petition seeking his eviction from the premises under the parameters of the Delhi Rent Control Act. So, aside from a demonstration of whether the defendant or the respondent was served or not, proper apt service is also very crucial to demonstrate the exact time when the defendant or respondent was served, because that is what will then decide your entitlement in terms of your ability to be able to file pleadings or otherwise represent your case before the court concerned. So again, this is something, this aspect of issuance of summons, which to a large extent today is taken care of by the infrastructure, or what you may call the support staff of a lawyer's office. So this is not something which a lot of lawyers, even young lawyers for that matter, when they join firms, a lot of this is taken care of by the support staff, say the court clerk, etc. So this is something which you may not, let's say, encounter, but it is, again, as I mentioned, at least in the earliest years, it is always good to be able to go and do this at least a couple of times personally, so that one is aware of the process which is followed by the court at this crucial stage. Now, this is as far as notice is concerned. Now, what happens once notice is actually received by a defendant or a respondent? Now we come to the subsequent pleadings. I'll deal with applications at the very end, but what are the other pleadings? Now, this is something which used to confuse me greatly when I just started practice. The different terminologies we give to the subsequent pleadings which may occur in a particular case. Now, let's take two examples. Let's first take a typical civil suit under the CPC. Now, the primary pleading in a suit, the suit itself, is technically referred to as a plaint. Though, of course, the word suit is also commonly used nowadays. The defendant, in response to what the plaint says or the suit says, will file what is called a written statement. So, in the case of suits under the CPC, replies, effectively it's a reply. Replies are referred to as written statements. The defendant, along with his written statement, may also file a counterclaim. So that's the pleading as far as the defendant is concerned in response to the plaint. Now, automatically, the plaintiff gets a right to file a written statement to the counterclaim put in place by the defendant. Because naturally, a counterclaim in a variety of judgments, as also the statutory framework, is recognized as a separate entitlement or as a separate suit in itself, even though it's termed as a counterclaim because it is being articulated within the very same proceeding. One aspect which is very common now, but surprisingly does not form a part of the statutory framework in the strict sense, is what is called a replication. A replication is nothing but a rejoinder, that is, the plaintiff's response to what the written statement of the defendant says. A replication is not essentially a matter of right in the strict sense, but nowadays, in common parlance, replications are filed in almost every matter. In the same breath, the defendant also gets a right to file a replication to the written statement filed by the plaintiff to the counterclaim filed by the defendant. So essentially, the main pleadings in a suit are the plaint, the written statement, and the replication. A written statement is nothing but a reply, whereas a replication is nothing but a rejoinder. But the terms used under the CPC are written statement and replication, and you will find umpteen cases of lawyers getting ticked off by judges on the original side when they refer to a replication as a rejoinder or a written statement as a reply. So ultimately, it's a matter of terminology, but please bear in mind the correct terms in a suit are written statement and replication. In almost every other proceeding outside the CPC, Typically, the terms used are petition for the main pleading, what the petitioner wants to say, the reply thereof by the other side, and the rejoinder. In the case of writ proceedings, it is writ petition, and the reply is in many jurisdictions termed as a counter affidavit. And once again, there is a rejoinder by the petitioner concerned. So, in many cases, when you refer to something as a counter affidavit, effectively you are referring to a reply. Now, as I said, this is more a matter of semantics in terms of what these pleadings mean, but one must be aware of the specific context in which these different terms are used. Now, in the case of written statement or in the case of a replication, naturally there is going to be a repudiation of what the counterparty has stated. And therefore, these pleadings, or if you may call it that, are what essentially lay the basis for things going forward. We had already dealt with this in some detail in the session where we dealt with the essentials of drafting. But the importance of these pleadings will get more enmeshed once we come to the next session, where we'll be talking about striking of issues, which is again a very important aspect of a suit or a proceeding, particularly under the CPC. Now, this is as far as pleadings are concerned. But dehors these main pleadings in a variety of litigation, not just civil suits, arbitration, writ petitions, etc. You will be required to file what are called interim applications. Now, interim applications can be of varied types, and it is important to understand them both from the legal aspect in terms of what they reflect substantively, but also what they reflect or represent strategically. Now, to give you a very broad overview of what these different kinds of injunctions are, we can refer to this particular piece, which very briefly sets them out. Now, obviously, this piece is from a foreign background, from the UK, so there is going to be a small difference in terms of the categorization, etc. But largely, this is effectively how the different kinds of interim applications work. Now, for today's class, we will also deal with in great detail with the interim injunction applications, which we will come to towards the end. But the other applications, I will quickly take you through. Now, the very first application, which will usually accompany a pleading at the very outset, that is, it will accompany either the plaint or the writ petition or any application or petition, is the application for an injunction or any interim prayer. Now, this we will come to in detail because this is something which is essentially bread and butter or very, very frequent in the majority of the litigation. So therefore, this we will come to in great detail. But before that, what are the other kinds of applications which might have to be made? Let's take an example for the first one, applications for extension of time. Now, as a defendant, if you are not able to file your written statement within the time provided, you may want to pray to the court that kindly permit me to file this with some delay. Now, applications usually are not made in advance, but they are filed along with the pleading concern. For instance, under a particular statute to file a reply, I am given a period of 90 days with a maximum extension further thereof of 60 days. So ideally, between 90 to 150, I have a right to ask a court, at least to consider my request, to permit me to place on record the pleading, even though there is a delay beyond the 90-day threshold. So in a variety of cases, you may have to file these applications if your pleading is beyond time. For instance, in the case which I just mentioned, if the reply is being filed by you, let's say on the 145th day, you are effectively looking at a delay of 55 days. So you will have to move an interim application along with the pleading once you file it, saying this is being filed with a 55-day delay. A, B, C, D, E are the reasons why I could not file it in time. This application is being made in a bona fide manner. It will be very egregious for me if my right to file a reply is completely taken away because of this. And therefore, kindly permit me to place this on record. That's a typical application for extension of time. The other application which may arise is in the case of some specialized statutes, or in the case of certain specialized provisions within overall statutes, which permit you to actually apply for a shortcut adjudication. Now, when I say shortcut adjudication, what I rely on and refer to are certain provisions under the procedural laws, for instance, the CPC, which actually permit you to have a matter adjudicated upon finally without the rigmarole of trial. This is something we had talked about when we talked about pre-litigation strategy, what are the checklists, etc., etc. And also what we had talked about when we said why drafting pleadings is such an important task. Now, what are the two good examples of this? Let's say you are in a civil suit. You are the plaintiff. The defendant files a written statement which contains multiple admissions as to your entitlement. Under the CPC, there is a provision called Order 12 Rule 6, under which you may ask a court to decree your suit on the basis of admissions made in the written statement. Therefore, if you want to avoid the long rigmarole of a trial, which is going to come about in the sense that there will be there will be admission denial of documents, there will be framing of issues, etc., etc., and then there will be oral evidence followed by the final oral arguments. You can, if you are able to demonstrate that admission, be able to secure a decree for your client at that very initial stage when only the pleadings have been filed on record. This is, let's say, if you are the plaintiff. If you are a defendant and the way the plaintiff's suit is filed or articulated is so problematic in the sense that it does not establish a cause of action, or it is manifestly barred by a particular statute, then under Order 7, Rule 11 of the CPC, as a defendant, you can ask for a rejection of a plaint at a preliminary stage. If there is no territorial jurisdiction, under Order 7, Rule 10, you can ask for a return of the plaint, or whatever may be the case. So many a times you will have interim applications which are geared towards ensuring that you get what is a summary judgment, whether it's for the plaintiff or for the respondent. So this is also an application which can be filed at the interim stage, and it can possibly be something which results in a early result in the matter to the benefit of whoever is the entity which you are representing. Now, another application which is relatively common is an application for amendment. Now, under various statutes, including the CPC Arbitration Act also, many a times parties feel that there is a slight ambiguity in what was pleaded by them, or that they have incorrectly made a particular statement. Then, subject to the overall parameters for granting such an amendment, because there are certain parameters under the CPC that you cannot resile from an admission, you cannot completely change the nature of your case, etc., etc. You can ask for a specified amendment to be made in your pleading, so that if there are any loopholes or any serious problems in your pleading which can create serious repercussions for you in the future, this can be avoided by an early amendment, which will ensure that your case then proceeds smoothly as compared to how it would have been otherwise. Something similar is an application, say, for taking on record additional documents. Now, sometimes during the trial, you may discover documents which were completely unavailable with you, or you may believe that there were certain documents which you thought to be irrelevant, but actually were quite relevant, and you need to place them on record. Now, again, subject to the parameters applicable in the particular statute, as to whether you did this in a timely manner or not, are the documents relevant, does it manifestly prejudice the other side if the documents are taken on record, etc. You might be, or you will be able to file an application for taking on record additional documents, subject to what the actual merits of your application might be, and will be adjudicated upon by the court or the forum concerned. So this is like an overarching view or a bird's eye view of what are the different kinds of applications which you might be required to put forth in a case before the actual rigmarole of a trial comes to an end. And there are innumerable number of applications which might be filed. And as I mentioned to you when we spoke about the drafting element of it, I had mentioned this one lawyer who was famous for ensuring that the case gets dragged on for years at an end, because he was such an expert at digging out these obscure provisions and filing interim applications under them. And the court would just be full of, deciding these applications and would never be able to really get to the merits of the matter. So applications are also regularly filed by practitioners as a strategy or a way of ensuring that in whatever way there is a certain advantage that is gained by the client. Now, obviously, this is a risky proposition because if your application is found to be completely without merit, particularly in today's day and time when there is a docket explosion, there might be imposition of heavy costs, or there might be an element of severe prejudice which might be associated with your client, whoever files the application concerned. So naturally, this is something not to be taken lightly. In fact, there is a urban myth that a lot of firms across jurisdictions have something called like a practice manual, where there is like a step-by-step guide for every associate that A, B, C, D, E application is to be filed in every case, irrespective of what the case is. So, it's like a standard book. Now, I have seen one of these, though I'm not sure of the provenance of the same, in one large firm, apparently, which has this. And it's really funny to know that, irrespective of what the case is, whether it's a partition suit or a suit for damages, if that firm is there, inevitably it will end up filing those, standard stereotype applications. So applications definitely very, very important, provided, they are something which you can actually pitch to the court in a sensible manner. But again, like I said, don't fall into the trap of moving stereotypical applications, particularly in today's day and age when, let's say, courts have far less patience for speculative litigation. Now, that is as far as your primary kind of applications under the Indian legal scenario are concerned. Now, interim injunctions. See, as I mentioned at the very outset to you, interim injunctions are let's say, a special genre of applications, because inevitably, in the vast majority of cases, a suit or a proceeding will be accompanied by an application for interim relief, particularly for an application for an injunction, an interim injunction. There is a reason for this. See, in the vast majority of litigations, ultimately you are looking at a final adjudication as to your right many years into the future. Depending on the kind of litigation it is and depending on the kind of forum it is before, you might be looking at anything between, say, 6 months or a year to possibly 10 to 15 years before you finally have an adjudication conclusively in your favor. Now, what this creates a problem, why this creates a problem is because in the interregnum, when your rights are yet to be finally adjudicated, the subject matter of the property might get dissipated or obliterated because of overt acts or omissions on the part of the defendant. To give you an example, you file a suit for specific performance against a party with which you had an agreement to sell you, let's say, his bungalow in a particular city. So A and B enter into an agreement saying B will sell his bungalow to A for 2 crore rupees. A accordingly pays an advance of 1.5 crores. And on the day on which B is supposed to transfer the bungalow, A is supposed to pay the remaining 50 lakhs. That day comes and goes. A calls B. B is non-responsive. He doesn't turn up. He doesn't pick up the call. So naturally, A is worried because he is given 1.5 in advance. He has an agreement with B that the property will be sold to him. But now he starts distrusting the intentions of B. He goes to a lawyer. The lawyer says, file a suit for specific performance. Now, let's say the suit is filed in the year 2010 and no application for an interim relief or injunction is made. Finally, the suit is decreed in the year 2020. In the interregnum, it is discovered that the defendant has sold, or B has sold the property to C. C has sold it to D. D has further sold it to E. E has further sold it to 10 other people. So ultimately, when you get a decree against B 10 years later for the specific performance, asking B to transfer the property to A, B no longer has the property. It's actually gone to somebody else. So therefore, a significant difficulty with not seeking an interim injunction is simply this, that your subject matter of the property completely dissipates by the time the litigation is over, leaving you effectively with nothing. Now, which is exactly why interim applications or injunctions are crucial in a large number of litigations. Now, there are certain litigations where you may not really need an interim injunction. For instance, you wish to sue the government for a particular amount of money. Now, the government is not something which is going to get, I mean, obviously, we can't say that anymore for sure, but the government is not supposed to be an entity which will become bankrupt, say, in 10 or 15 years when you actually win the matter. So you don't have to worry that in the interregnum, the government may not, let's say, sell away its assets or do anything to create a charge on them. Because the government is well provisioned to ensure that whenever you succeed, if and when you succeed, you will be able to recover your money. So in the case of a recovery suit in a large number of cases, etc., an interim application may not be required. But in a large number of the other cases, say you're asking for specific performance, you are asking for a, let's say, a final decree in terms of violation of your intellectual property, or you are asking for an injunction against invocation of bank guarantees. In all of these matters, necessarily you will need an interim application. Now, when it comes to interim applications or interim injunctions, you need to bear in mind three golden phrases. Always use these phrases in every application for interim injunction, and they must form part of your standard practice in terms of drafting interim applications. These three phrases are a existence of a prima facie case, existence of balance of convenience, and irreparable loss. So these might sound similar, but in a more nuanced exposition, one would find that these are actually relatively separate and different in terms of what they actually require to be established. So the simplest of this is a prima facie case. A prima facie case is nothing but demonstrating to a court at an interim stage that on the basis of whatever is available before it on the record at that stage, the plaintiff is able to make out a good case. Now let's go back to the example of A versus B. In this case, A would say, sir, I have an agreement signed between me and B. B is agreed to sell the property to me for a sum total of 2 crores, and I have already paid him 1.5 crores. So the majority of the considerations already passed to him. Therefore, I have a good case today, irrespective of whatever may happen in the trial in the future. So, I mean, if one takes the strict view of the matter, any court would, in such a situation, be obliged to grant you a temporary injunction because a prima facie case can be said to be made out in these circumstances. The second aspect is balance of convenience. Now, balance of convenience is nothing but a balancing act in terms of the effect that the injunction will have on both parties. Now, to give you a practical example, again, going back to A versus B, what is the balance of convenience? You are only asking that B not deal with the property in terms of alienating it or creating third party rights in the interregnum when the suit is ongoing or proceeding. So when a judge weighs the balance of convenience, the inconvenience which would be caused to A by refusal to grant the injunction is far higher than the relatively smaller inconvenience that would be caused to B by only injuncting him from not dealing with the property during the period that the suit is pending. Now, this obviously ties into prima facie case because what is the extent of the inconvenience, who is more inconvenienced, will also draw flavor from the prima facie case because a court will consider the fact that A is out of pocket today by 1.5 crores and B actually has that money with him. Therefore, when you consider it in the background of the prima facie case parameters, naturally the balance of convenience tilts significantly in favor of A in this scenario. The final parameter is irreparable loss. This is somewhat similar to balance of convenience, but not exactly so, because irreparable loss is required to be proved by the plaintiff or substantially established to be able to secure an injunction. Irreparable loss is nothing but a demonstration of the fact that if this injunction is not granted to the plaintiff, he or she will not be able to be recompensed in a manner in the future which will actually be able to completely justify or bring him or her back, that is the plaintiff back, to the same position as would have obtained if the injunction had actually been granted. Now, to give you an example, in A versus B, you decided to buy B's house for a very specific reason. Let's say it's a corner plot in a colony you love. There is a park in front of the building. It's Vastu compliant or whatever, depending on how you view these things. So ultimately, if A does not get an injunction, possibly say after 10 years when he wins the suit, he might be able to get some damages from me. But he will never be able to receive this house, which was the express subject matter of agreement between him and B. So, in such a scenario, you can demonstrate to the court that if you don't grant me the injunction today, I am going to face an irreparable loss or damage, which which I will not be able to overcome at a later stage in the proceedings, even if the court were to hold something in my favor. So these three, always remember, are required to be pleaded by you. You will be surprised at the number of judgments you will find where the court rejects applications on the simple ground that these three parameters have not been pleaded, and these three parameters are statutorily, textually, specifically expressed in the CPC, but they are now the gold standard across civil litigation in terms of how courts look at whether interim injunctions are to be granted or not. For instance, to give you a practical example, there is somewhat something similar under the Arbitration Act, whereby a court has power under Section 9 to grant interim relief. Similarly, an arbitral tribunal also has the power under Section 17 to grant interim relief. Now, the precedent around Section 9 and Section 17, the overwhelming precedent is that the court or the arbitral tribunal, as the case may be, that decides to or is contemplating granting an interim injunction is required to follow the broad spirit of the parameters under Order 39, Rule 1 and 2 of the CPC, which sets out this triple test in terms of what a plaintiff or a petitioner is required to establish. Therefore, always remember, whenever you are either confronted with an application for interim relief or interim injunction, or you are drafting and filing an application on the same lines, always remember to plead these three crucial elements. It is elementary. You will not be able to succeed otherwise. Now, there is in this article a more detailed elaboration of what these different elements are. I would recommend that you go through them in your spare time. Also, always remember that ultimately interim reliefs are discretionary in nature. When I say discretionary, it does not mean that there is complete ipsy-dixy on the part of the court concerned, but sometimes even after establishing all elements, the court may, for whatsoever reason, for instance, most importantly, your conduct might refuse to grant you the discretion prayed for. The reason for this is you will find multiple judgments where the plaintiff comes to court after having suppressed something or actually having, let's say, manipulated the record in some way. So the common legal terminology to define such conduct is that the court was approached with unclean hands. Now, if you do this, even if you meet all three of the parameters provided for under the statute, you can still be refused an injunction because ultimately the court can take into account your conduct when you approached it. Now, similarly, since ultimately, to a certain extent, the court is required to balance equities in the sense of balance of convenience, etc., the court may also require you or put you to certain terms before the injunction in question is granted. Now, to come back to the example of A versus B, remember you still have a 25% component of the consideration to be paid to B. That amounts to approximately 50 lakhs, exactly 50 lakhs. So a court may well ask you, while granting you injunction against B, to deposit that 50 lakhs with the court instantly. Because one, it will show your bona fides. Secondly, that amount, if it lies in court, will earn interest. And in future, if at all the litigation comes in your favor, then the remaining consideration can then be directed to be given up to B. Because ultimately, that is something B is entitled to under the agreement between both of you, between A and B. So these are the essential factors or parameters to be kept in mind when one deals with interim injunctions.
Obviously, there is a lot of nuance. There are a lot of smaller issues which may arise when a court is confronted with whether to grant an interim injunction or not. And that is something you will find in detail in this article. Lots of practical examples in terms of decided case law. And this is again something which I would recommend that you go through outside of class hours. So, as we saw today, ultimately, the entirety of the pleadings before the court in terms of what the parties intend to say in writing is more or less covered. Now, what is the stage forward is something which we will be dealing with in the subsequent classes. And that is something which is of a slightly different background and context, which we will see when we come to it, because ultimately these now will leapfrog from the pleadings and sort of enter into a different regime altogether. So now we will, in the classes which will follow, we will be dealing with admission denial of documents, framing of issues, how oral evidence is presented, etc., etc. So if there are, so again, like I said, this is also an important aspect what we dealt with today in terms of the practical elements of litigation and what exactly they entail in the longer run. So if there are any queries in relation to what we've discussed today, then please feel free to shoot your questions whatsoever they may be. And again, like I said, please bear in mind the fact that these are all crucial elements in terms of how a litigation proceeds. You will find multiple cases of interim injunctions just being drafted, for the heck of it, without any application of mind, because you get typically used to this in almost every case. But do bear in mind that in many cases, something as simple as this or as simple as service of notice can be extremely contested, and it can lead you into a significant problem if these issues are not addressed properly. So that's it for me for today's session. If there are any queries, then yeah, you can just let me know in the chat box. Yeah, all of you seem to be really well versed with litigation in terms of the lack of any queries. But yeah, great, no problem. So therefore, I think then we'll call it a day for today, and we will move on to the other elements on the next session, and I will upload the relevant reading material as always. Right. All right, guys. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.